I want to get back to sort of the more grounded approach here of how this stuff works, right? There was an amazing concept or term that was coined called neuroception, right? And really, I've sort of shortened it, and it's kind of the body's ability to subconsciously read and respond to environmental cues. So this is a quote from, I believe, Stephen Porges. He says, "It's how neural circuits distinguish whether situations or people are safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. The detection of a person as safe or dangerous triggers neurobiologically determined pro-social or defensive behaviors. So even though we may not be aware of danger on a cognitive level, on a neurophysiological level, our body has already started a sequence of neural processes that would facilitate adaptive defense behaviors such as fight, flight, or freeze." So what are we talking about? We're talking about, I think the easiest example of this that everybody can relate to is that if I went up to the average person and I said, "Hey, Joe, I'm going to ask you in 2 weeks, you've got to give a graduation ceremony address to Harvard, to the graduating class, and you're going to be speaking to them and make it good." This guy's going to freak out, right? He's got to deliver a public address, and it's got to be, it's got to be pretty good to deliver it to these Harvard graduating class. Speaking publicly, this is a funny one, right? What's happening? Most of us, even me to this day, when I go up and speak publicly in certain instances, especially, heart rate starts to increase, blood pressure increases, I start getting hot, might sweat a little bit, armpits start to sweat. I actually lose a little bit of cognitive capacity, right? So I'm actually getting into this fight or flight, this kind of sympathetic overdrive state, right? My hands might get a little clammy. Mouth might get dry. This is what's happening. It's like I'm running from a bear, right? But I'm really not. I'm just standing up there, perhaps talking to a bunch of other humans. But there's something that was ingrained in me as a child that made this situation feel unsafe, right? Whether I was going to be judged, perhaps I wasn't going to be perfect. I was going to be, usually it's being judged and not feeling worthy or enough, right? So this is a belief system. That's all this is. And we all all of us, most of us have this. It's a belief system that if I go up there, I'm going to make a fool of myself and these people are not going to accept me and I'm not going to be loved. And that's a very, very powerful message subconsciously that we're sort of experiencing, right? So just because I'm giving an address, all of a sudden my biology is responding. And my biology is responding to a belief that was ingrained at an early age. That's it. So this is something that happens all the time. If a stressful situation happens, maybe we lose a lot of money. You go to a casino and watch somebody lose a ton of money. Like, they'll get pissed, right? And it's like, there's a fear response there because the lack of safety, right? The safety has just gone away in the money, and now there's fear and anger. So these are things that are happening physiologically that we're not even aware of. And so oftentimes when we go into these situations, our body's going to respond in either a way that's safe or it's going to be some sort of fear response. Right? And this kind of ties into Porges' work, the polyvagal theory. And again, this is theory. This is not based in fact necessarily, but it seems to be bearing out that this is the case. And
I'd say there's a remarkable number of people that resonate with this. And I think it's a really good explanatory model for a lot.
I do too. It's a model that whether or not it's perfectly correct, it works, right? To explain what's happening. And so I agree. I think for me, it's settled, but just putting it out there, it's still considered a theory. But, and it actually ties into Robert Navio's work too, right? With the cell danger response. And essentially the idea here is that we have 3 modes of operation. Before we used to think about 2 modes, right? The vagus nerve would fire in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. Sympathetic being this sort of fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is this rest and digest, right? But there's another phase of the parasympathetic, which is supposedly the good side, right? Now we can't think about it as the good side. There is no good or bad. It just responds. But the parasympathetic involves this freeze, right? It's the dorsal side of the vagus nerve that is a freeze response. So you see at the bottom, we have social engagement, right? This is calmness and connection, settled, groundedness, curiosity, openness, compassion. These are all beautiful, amazing emotions and states, right? That we want to be in. But it's not like you can just flip a switch and decide to be in that state. Your body's actually determining the state that you're in, along with your mind, of course. The mind can lead the body and the body can lead the mind. But oftentimes we have a subconscious computer program running in the background that prevents us from getting into this social engagement, this relaxed parasympathetic rest and digest state. So if that's something, if you have a computer virus that's running in the background, you can't run your programs very well, no matter what you do, until you get rid of the virus. It's sort of the same thing. We got to get rid of this program, or integrate it rather, so that we can run this social engagement relaxed state. Otherwise, we're going to go to sympathetic, which is a great state to be in, right? This is fear, panic, rage, anger. This serves a role, and your body's physiology will respond. And then if that doesn't shut off or it gets too intense, it's going to move into this freeze of like, okay, we don't know what to do now. Let's stop. Let's reserve our energy, because what we were using actually is not very useful. It's not getting us anywhere. So let's just pause, to shut down for now. And that is a brilliant response by the body, because what it's saying is, I was trying this tactic of turning on all these sympathetic responses and it didn't work. So let's just shut that down. Let's reserve our energy. So this is how it ties into the energy stuff, right? If we're in social engagement, that is this restful state. We are preserving or holding on to our energy in a way that allows us to be creative, that allows us to be useful in terms of what we would typically want to do with our life, right? And granted, it also reserves energy for responding in case we need to in this fight or flight state. So it's a really great place to rest in. If we are expending energy in this fight or flight in a way that is useful, running from a bear, fantastic, right? Really, really good use of that resource, of that energy that you've reserved because you've typically been in the social engagement relaxed state. But if you're on stage giving a speech, that's a waste of energy, right? Turning on all these sympathetic systems just to give a speech, that is a maladaptive response that was created from an early state. So it's a really poor use of energy, right? So we're actually not using energy efficiently, especially if I can't think very well, right? Because blood's going into different parts of the brain. So this is really key, because as we go throughout our day, we might be triggering into this sympathetic response, or we may be spending most of our day there when we don't need to be. And it's because we have this low-level anxiety of whatever situation in our life, right? Don't like my boss, afraid of getting fired, whatever the case is, husband-wife situation, kids, there's all these things that can trigger us. A coronavirus, that's one that triggers us, right? Even without getting this virus, we can be triggered into a state where we are making really poor use of the energy that we have. So we're expending it on this sort of fight or flight response. So this is really, really important to recognize. And again, I mentioned it ties into Navio's work in the cell danger response. He sees the same thing at the cellular level with the mitochondria. They will be in a social engagement type of phase where it's restful and they're using energy efficiently. And then boom, a threat comes in and we expending all this ATP. We eject it outside the cell. We're communicating. We're like threat, danger, right? And that's a really good use of that energy if we have a real threat. But if that doesn't shut off, we're screwed, right? We're wasting energy. And then what he's also highlighting is the other phase of this cell danger response, which is this freeze phase, which we can get stuck. And that's the chronic fatigue stuff, right? It's like you're stuck in this phase where you have the energy, but you can't use it because your body's stuck in this state. And so we got to get back to this ability to rest in the social engagement state and then flip on the sympathetic side when we need it.
Yeah. So much I want to comment on there. So much great stuff in there. I will say one interesting piece that links Navio's work with or just polyvagal theory is, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Martine Picard's work in mitochondrial psychobiology. But
I'm not. See, this is what I mean. Ari teaches me stuff and he points me over here and then I have to go research all this stuff. So he gave me some homework. Great.
He's got some great research on there. I know you dig to just dive into the studies themselves. You'll also have fun listening to the interview that I've done with him on the podcast.
Ah, beautiful.
Great guy, super smart guy. But the gist of it is basically they've determined that psychological stress, they've measured the effect of psychological stress on mitochondrial function literally minutes later and shown that intense psychological stress leads to leakage of mitochondrial DNA into the bloodstream literally within a few minutes subsequent to psychological stress. And that mitochondrial DNA, like the purinergic molecules like ATP, ADP, act as cell danger signals to the rest of the body.
Interesting. So this is what I mean. This is like, we're starting to map this stuff, but it's like, the question I have is how the heck does that happen?
Yeah.
right? It's like we have a thought or belief system, and all of a sudden it's turning on certain genes and cues to then eject this stuff that then communicates to other mitochondria to create this. I mean, it's magic. It's almost magic, right?
Yeah.
It's really, really profound.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I love that. And it's a great explanation for what's happening, right? And let's remember, the vagus nerve, or all of our nervous system, is just made up of the same stuff that other cells are made of, right? It's in fact more mitochondria in the nervous system than most of the places in our body. So, it's really it's one and the same, right? This is what's happening. It's just on a cellular level and on a systems level, we can think about them in different ways if we want, but it's the same stuff.
Yeah. The only other thing I wanted to say on this is I've had a couple near-death experiences in my life. A couple. Yeah. Yes. I have a brother, an older brother is my best friend. I've done a lot of traveling with him all over the world. And he's doesn't have a strong sense of danger.
He pushes the limit.
Yeah. Like he just kind of has a feeling like we should just go for it. Like whenever you're in a dangerous situation, like my brain's wired to assess risk in every like facet possible. And he's just like, his brain doesn't do any of that. He's just like, let's just go. What could go wrong? When's the next time you're going to be in Costa Rica and have an opportunity to surf, 15-foot waves?
It's convincing arguments. It sounds like.
Yeah. And I always, like a dummy, I'm always like, I guess you're right. I guess I won't be in Costa Rica and have another opportunity to surf these waves. So in one particular time, I almost drowned. And, I won't take you through the whole details of all the story, but basically got held down by a big, big wave, got dragged underwater for a long period of time. Just when you feel like you are not going to make it, you finally make it to the surface, you get a breath, and then another wave comes right down on you. And then, that happens 3 or 4 times. And I've literally been underwater and like had the feeling, and, you become hyper aware of what you're thinking. And you go from intense struggling, I got to get up, I got to get up, I got to get a breath. And then at a certain point, you actually just accept it. You actually just accept, oh, okay, I guess this is the end. Now I'm about to die. And I've actually been in that mental state, which I kind of interpret as a shift from fight or flight to freeze, to like just, I'm accepting that I cannot do anything about this. But that was a moment in time. What's interesting is that it seems to be possible, as you alluded to get kind of stuck in this freeze response and just kind of have apathy and fatigue and lack of vitality and depression, like across the board, and just kind of be stuck in that nervous system state.
Absolutely. And it's, coming back to energy and thinking about energy and how we utilize it, right? It's the extraction of energy from the environment, and it's utilizing it effectively. And if we're not using it, right, then we're actually making poor use of whatever energy we extract, right? So it's almost like this flow. We want to keep the flow of energy coming, right? We bring it in and we use it effectively. We bring it in and we use it effectively. And if it's stuck, then we're not using the energy that we have, then it's just a really bad use. And of course, we end up with these symptoms and these things that we're dealing with. So I just love the CDR and polyvagal theory as a way to explain some of these things, because for so long we got it wrong. I think we thought that it was fight or flight or not. And if people were not in fight or flight, then it was like, okay, well, you're good. But no, they're literally not able to get out of that state. Yeah. And that's critical to do. So it's like not being able to get out of bed. It's like, just because you're in bed doesn't mean that's a good thing. It's like sleeping is good and moving around and going about your day is good, but not being able to get out of bed is not a good thing. Yeah. So, we got to be able to get out of that state effectively.
It actually has to do with polyvagal theory. So we mentioned this briefly previously, but polyvagal theory was developed by a doctor named Stephen Porges, who realized he'd been studying heart rate variability in the vagus nerve for a long time. Since the 1960s, and he was doing research in a neonatal intensive care unit. And what he found was that as the babies there are sick, obviously that's why they're there. As their situation worsened, as they got kind of closer and closer to more danger zone of perhaps dying or anything like that, their heart rate would drop, but their heart rate variability would go up. But this was not a sign that they were improving. This was a sign that they were in more danger of what's called neurogenic bradycardia, which is that, or they had neurogenic bradycardia, which was more danger that their heart would stop. And so it was a bit of a paradox. And so I actually contacted him a year ago saying, what is going on? That there's this, there seems to be a phenomenon where people are getting more stressed and their heart rate variability is going up. And he said, you just rediscovered the vagal paradox that led me to develop polyvagal theory. So I think a lot of people are becoming increasingly aware of polyvagal theory, especially because its immense importance of understanding the autonomic nervous system and how it responds to trauma and trauma responses. But what the reason why, to answer your question, why increased heart rate variability is usually associated with being healthier, but sometimes is not, is because when we have that kind of that more newly evolved, later developed ventral vagal part of the vagus nerve that's associated with resilience and recovery and good digestion, all of that sort of fitness, that will increase heart rate variability, but so will that shutdown of life threat will also increase heart rate variability. My instinct, and I'm finding some support for this in the literature, but one thing I would love to see happen is one way to test whether or not your heart rate variability measure is going to be reliable or how to interpret it is to do what's called an orthostatic tolerance test. So when you go from lying down or sitting to standing up, your heart rate should go up, your blood pressure should go up. Now, if your heart rate goes up too much, that's called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And so that is POTS, that the vagus nerve, the brake of the vagus nerve should come off gently to gently allow the heart rate to go a little bit faster. But if the vagal tone is not that strong, then when you stand up, the brake flies off and then your heart starts racing too much. Conversely, if you stand up and your heart rate doesn't go up, maybe even it goes down, and your blood pressure doesn't go up, which is a problem because you need the blood pressure to go up to keep the brain perfused. So if you stand up and your blood pressure does not go up or it even goes down, that is a sign that the dorsal vagal, that survival shutdown part of the vagus nerve is too active and it's not releasing that brake to allow your body to adapt to the new situation of standing up. So if someone is in that camp, then I would question the interpretation of a higher heart rate variability, meaning that they are healthier for that person.
Very interesting. I know there's some sort of technical aspect of whether the heart rate variability is taken standing, seated, or laying down, and you can get different numbers depending on that. I wonder if, given what you just explained, if one of those options of taking HRV might be particularly more accurate in eliminating the variation in people with POTS.
Yeah, I think there are different opinions on that, and there's a lot of literature on. There's even like a task force paper on the right and wrong ways of taking HRV. What I can say is that taking a heart rate variability measurement in different positions is a different measurement. It's a different thing. You don't want to compare apples to oranges. If you're using this as a measure as an individual, then you just need to make sure you're consistent. So if you're going to do it sitting, do it sitting. Yeah.
So it's interesting, given this sort of some demographic of people or some instances, some scenarios, contexts in some people where heart rate variability goes up, but is sort of deceptive in that way, is not actually indicative of better health. It's interesting to acknowledge that still, despite that, heart rate variability is robustly, as you said. I mean, you even made the case. I would maybe push back on this a little bit, but that's a different discussion. I largely agree with you that it's one of the absolute best markers. So it's interesting that it is so robust in predicting health outcomes and mortality, even in spite of the fact that sometimes you can have high heart rate variability in instances where it's not really painting an accurate picture.
100%. Well, to give you an example that actually I just got from my dad when I had a conversation with him recently, is that if you look at weight in the population, then we'll get a global trend of as people become more overweight, then their health tends to be worse and their longevity tends to be less. But it's a J-shaped curve. So people who are at the bottom end will also tend to have health problems as well. But if you are not, if you're zooming out, or if your level of zoom isn't right, or if you're not asking the right question, then that relationship between weight and longevity is going to hold as a positive relationship, even though people at the bottom end are going to have the reverse, where they might need to gain weight to be healthier.
I might add a nuance or an additional sort of distinction there. I would say there's a lot of things like that where we find a J-shaped curve or U-shaped curve where both being on the high end and the low end are problematic. I mean, even things like cholesterol levels and LDL levels, you can find that kind of thing. mTOR is another good example, and IGF-1 is another good example. I'm probably not mTOR, but IGF-1 is sort of almost synonymous with that, right? It's all this hubbub that's made of excessive mTOR activation and IGF-1 driving risk for cancer, but the risk of mortality is just as high among people who have excessively low IGF-1 levels. And there's a lot of things like this, testosterone and many other hormones.
mTOR is actually the key molecule to signal summer metabolism.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So maybe we'll come back to that. Okay. So one nuance that I wanted to add, this is what I thought your dad was going to say. And I have some personal experience with this because I have at many times in my life been told that based on BMI, I'm overweight, right? And I'm, generally I hover around 9 to 12% body fat. I have abs, right? So I'm based on this simple measurement, which is just a function of weight over height. Yes. Rather than taking actual body fat percentage, it tells people who are athletes and who are muscular that they are more in the overweight category often. And so that is sort of disrupting that metric to a large degree by lumping in athletes with lots of muscle mass who are highly fit with people who are actually overweight and sedentary.
Yeah, BMI, in my opinion, is a measurement that only makes sense to apply to people who are obese. It doesn't make sense to apply that measure to anybody else, or I suppose I'm very underweight.
Yeah. I want to go back to polyvagal theory for a minute. And I'm just curious, since you've explored it in depth, I know that there is some pushback in certain circles against this theory. And I think there's one researcher in particular that has really gone after Stephen Porges and written a number of peer-reviewed papers kind of attacking him and attacking this theory and saying that this is a bunch of pseudoscience and it's all, there's no such thing as this polyvagal stuff. It's all a bunch of nonsense. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first came across polyvagal theory, I immediately found it very useful. And that's the thing with any model, it's not so much like, is it the ultimate truth? Is this useful? Is this accurately describing something in a way that makes it helpful, to navigate things, to solve problems? So when I came across it, I thought, wow, because what it's replacing is this idea that it's called arousal theory, that it's kind of this linear, like you're more awake or you're more asleep in terms of your nervous system. So I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And then my next question is, well, is this valid? Is it true? Is it a real thing? And amongst the different people I was studying with, some people said it was BS and it wasn't a real thing. Other people that I respected said that it was valid. And I'm very interested in it. So I did a deep dive and I've read most of what that author has written and other people have written. And there are blogs called Polyvagal Theory is Dead. And so I've looked at their critiques and they were interesting and they were compelling. And to his credit, Dr. Porges has written kind of a response to that. I think it might be a chapter in a new book. A lot of times they are arguing against something that he never said. And that happens a lot. And, the key paper where he first presented polyvagal theory. It was written in 1994, and it's very easy to find. So there's no like him not being honest, because it's just there, you know? And so sometimes it's that he never said something. Sometimes it's like they're arguing with a specific detail that even if there's validity to that criticism, it doesn't really detangle the accuracy or usefulness of the theory. So I think one example was where he's talking about the evolutionary development of the system, and where you have the dorsal vagal system first. And dorsal just means, think of it like a dorsal fin, it's just kind of on the backside. Then you have the sympathetic nervous system, and then you have the ventral vagal system, and how that evolved. And I think one of the critiques is that they can find like a really old fish that has a ventral vagal nerve, and therefore the whole thing is BS. And I don't want to kind of misrepresent Stephen Porges' very eloquent rebuttal, but at least in my mind, I'm like, this doesn't, you know, completely debunk the whole theory, you know, and the theory is sound. And I also did a very deep dive on the neuroanatomy of the vagus nerve, because some of these things are just really kind of easy to refute or to support from like a neurophysiological perspective. Like, are there two nuclei, which is like kind of I think of like, you know, hooking up like an old school stereo system, like where you just put things in and out, and, you know, and you have your speakers and the player and stuff. So there are two nuclei. Okay. And then there's all these studies, like what happens when you either chemically block one of them, or if you surgically block one, and you can see the differences in response. Another one of the critiques, which I thought was unfair, was talking about in those types of studies, you know, if you block, I think the ventral vagus aspect, you know, does what does the heart do? But really a big point of this theory is context. So when you're under life threat, is what he's saying, is that the vagus nerve will cause this bradycardia, this slowing down of the heart. And so for me, those studies didn't really answer that question. So it's not an ongoing question. It's an ongoing debate. I've been following it with interest for quite a few years. I've read both sides of it for a long time. I think that Dr. Porges' responses were very eloquent. And like I say, with most of these things, they're making arguments against something that he never said.
One of the things that you were just talking about is the mind-body connection. And this is framed in a way that, I mean, even the way that I just phrased it, you would probably object to say the mind-body connection. It's one system. But it's amazing to me to think about how much one's worldview or paradigm influences what one perceives they're working with. So, for example, conventional medicine often looks at what they're doing as, you know, disease processes that are the result of various biochemical abnormalities or biochemical mechanisms that have gone awry in some way, and now we need to use drugs to intervene in these pathological mechanisms to correct them. You know, so depression is you know, framed in psychiatry as a chemical imbalance, and most psychiatric issues are treated as are viewed from the paradigm of these are chemical imbalances, and we need a drug to intervene to correct the imbalance that's there. The classic thing in conventional medicine is more, you know, cholesterol is high levels of cholesterol and LDL and triglycerides are contributing to heart disease, atherosclerosis, and we need to use statin drugs to reduce this you know, cholesterol that is high for no good reason. And on and on and on. We could talk about 100 other examples of things like that. And then even in psychology, in clinical psychology, which I've done an entire, all the coursework for a PhD program in that. I've done all 3 years of coursework for my PhD in clinical psychology. And it's amazing to me to witness how siloed they are, just like psychiatry, and how reductionistic they are in the sense of treating psychological issues purely as psychological, as originating from psychological things. So the solution, whether you have depression or anxiety or bipolar or whatever, is to address the psychology of that, to do talk therapy, and how disconnected that is from even the existing body of evidence that we have around nutritional interventions, sleep hygiene and circadian rhythm interventions, that we know those things impact on these mental or psychological disorders. And yet, because they're operating in a paradigm of, psychological problems require psychological solutions, they don't connect to those bodies of literature. So you've got psychiatry prescribing drugs to fix chemical imbalances, and you've got psychology prescribing talk therapy to fix psychological abnormalities that they think originate purely from psychological things. But it's also disconnected from the broader picture of this being one system where all of the physical and biochemical stuff interplays with the psychological. So I'm curious how you paint that picture of, what is your paradigm when it comes to sort of conceptualizing the mind-body stuff?
I call it, and it's very true. May I just actually add another aspect? Functional
Sure.
medicine, it's all about the gut. It's all about the gut.
Uh-huh.
Well, what's messed up the gut? Like, let's ask the question, because why isn't everybody in that same boat? And we can obviously talk about the many root causes that obviously contribute to disease. And I'm not saying gut is not an issue. It is an issue, right? And when it comes to immunity, also, it is an issue. We know that. However, how is it that people end up with those microbiome issues, with leaky gut, with all of this stuff, right? What's the actual cause behind that? Because the gut is definitely not the ultimate root cause. I mean, come on, right? So we could literally go so far back. And I was talking to Master Mingtong Go actually the other day, and we were saying, like, literally you could go, well, what's the root cause of that? Okay, but what's the root cause of that? But you can go on and on, right? Yeah. And like I said, you can talk about ancestral trauma, like things that is in the field, all this stuff that is in the epigenetic stuff, but also like literally the stuff in our subtle field. So you can really go on and on about that. But my primary sort of like model from which I operate, if you like, is what I call the triangle of healing. So people have like different ways of describing the different pillars of health. But I go with the mental, emotional, the psychoenergetic, spiritual, and then obviously the physical. That includes structural stuff. And really what I talk about to my clients in my programs, in my book, is that you cannot remove any of those. Okay, so they're always going to be pieces in your healing. It's just a question of obviously how big those pieces are. But when it comes to the particularly the nervous system dysregulation and the emotional stuff, what I call emotional toxicity, I have never ever met anybody with chronic manifestations that would, somebody who'd be chasing their symptoms for a long period of time, who wouldn't have a degree of that. And so then it's just a question of how big a piece is that for you? Because for me, it was a giant piece, right? For somebody else, this may be a smaller piece. But of course, then we're looking at why is that relevant? It's relevant because if you come into this world, well, like I did, obviously, like I just said, with already a heightened emotional response, like set for fight or flight, because my pregnancy wasn't safe and my birth wasn't safe. So already I have so many more glucocorticoid receptors. My nervous system is already like set for fight or flight or even freeze, possibly. And already what that does is that sets you up for subsequent trauma. It makes it easier for you to be traumatized. And so then all of those different things that happen in childhood with all the attachment issues, which are just so easy. It's so easy to screw up a child, even if you're like the most wonderful, meaning, loving parent, because you're not inside the child's body And it really counts how the child perceives. It doesn't really matter that as a parent, you think like, I think I'm looking after my child, okay, you know, they're being fed and I'm giving them this and that and the other. Really, if the child doesn't think that their needs are being met, none of that matters. It's really just an internal perspective. And so all of those layers, there's so many layers. And then, of course, the big one is the social engineering. I mean, wow, right? So all of the different things that are like put on children in terms of the expectation, things they should or shouldn't do, things they should or shouldn't feel, blah, 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 all of that. There are just so many of those layers that is so then easy to just tip that nervous system balance over. And so ultimately health is about spending most of your time in this ventral vagus activation, right? The rest, digest, detoxify, and heal. But look at what's going on around us. Like most people are the opposite. They'll spend most of their time, even in their sleep, oftentimes, as we know, right? There's a lot of people with sleeping issues. And they will be activating those survival states chronically. So there's no issue with activating survival states. There is an issue if they're activated chronically and they really change the biochemistry, they change the neurochemistry. So you could be approaching healing from so many different angles, but I always think, what can we do to like tick as many boxes as we can, like quickly, so the person's body can start getting into body, mind, soul, everything gets into homeostasis and actually is able to heal. And through the many years that I've been doing this for, not through only my own experiences, but working with so many people, when you address particularly the early trauma and also the belief systems, because obviously particularly the early attachment stuff really impacts on our identity, and it most certainly impacts on our value and belief systems. And when we address that, it just seems like that's a big domino piece. So whether it is to do with just healing from chronic illness, or even, to be quite honest with you, achieving more optimal levels of health, because some people just view health as an absence of disease, but you know, I'm sure you agree, like to us, that we can go a lot higher than that. There is such a thing as an optimal level. Most people, when they're sick, they're just satisfied with just like, you know what, if I just get rid of the symptoms, I'll be happy. But there's so much further you can go. And I really don't think that you can get there without addressing some of those like chronic emotional conflicts and those push and pull that you've got in your head, or this, what I call emotional toxicity, right? So that's kind of how I approach it. It's like, how can we get people on that healing path as quickly as possible? And you know, what you talk a lot about, sleep, circadian rhythm, it's like the basic, that's actually just absolute basics, right? But of course, as we know, emotional toxicity can really get in the way of people's sleep. And I've got a ton of people with insomnia, and a lot of them have unresolved traumas, right? So it kind of, you see how it all just connects together, and you just really can't separate those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the key signs or symptoms that would clue somebody into how big of a piece it is for them this emotional toxicity is? Like, are there any sort of classic signs or symptoms that would lead one to think, oh, maybe these chronic symptoms I have are the result of unresolved trauma and emotional toxicity?
Yeah, the reason why I like to talk about symptoms, because when you talk to people just purely about trauma, a lot of people think like, nah, I don't have any traumas, right? And of course, like I said, you could have just a chain of micro traumas when you were little, and literally you wanted more cuddles and your mother was too busy to give you those cuddles, and bang, you've got attachment trauma. Or something like that, right? But that's one example that can totally happen and often does. But if we just talk to people about trauma and they don't have a broad enough understanding of trauma, they'll be like, yeah, I don't think that's a thing for me, right? But when you start talking about some of those emotional toxicity symptoms, things such as chronic fears, chronic anxieties, guilt and shame, that's a big one, chronic guilt, chronic shame. There is such a thing as healthy guilt and healthy shame, but most people, trust me, suffer from unbelievable, crazy amounts of chronic guilt and chronic shame, totally unjustified, and they just keep beating themselves up. So those symptoms, when you beat yourself up, when you keep fighting, with yourself in your head, so you have different parts to your psyche, and it's a very interesting thing to get into, because people will find that those different parts of the psyche are often having those arguments and fights, right? And so it feels very much like people are literally feel like they're having a fight going on inside their head. Well, that's emotionally toxic. Why is that a problem? Because it triggers fight or flight. So even though it may not seem to you like having an anxiety about something, or having social anxiety, or having ruminating thoughts, or overthinking, overanalyzing, overwhelm, even when people desensitize to that, because that's very often the case, right? People will often tell me, but that's how I've always been. I've always been like that. All right, well, just because you've desensitized and now you feel like you've always been that way, doesn't mean that you're not triggering your autonomic nervous system to be in this survival state. And then collectively, when you spend too much time in those survival states, you're not going to heal, because it's the part of the nervous system that enables you to heal is completely disengaged when you spend so much time in those survival states. So that's why this is relevant. And I mentioned the ventral vagus, the rest, digest, detoxify, and heal. We really need to engage that readily and frequently enough to be able for the healing processes, the regeneration, repair of tissues, and all of that to be able to take place. So when you have all of those things, like I said, like the emotional conflicts, chronic guilt, chronic anger, chronic fears, chronic shame, chronic guilt, and all of that, and then, like I said, the ones that people often don't really appreciate enough is things like overthinking, overanalyzing, really living up here, not connecting to the body, like really disconnected from emotions, disconnected from the body. That's another one. Being a doormat, because that's an adaptation. That's an adaptation to trauma in your early years. Perfectionism, right? Another one, right? So when you talk in those terms, you're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, no, I do have this problem, right? And so then you can go, okay, right, let's see where that's coming from. Because the reason why I call them symptoms is because they're just symptoms of something else that in itself not a thing. Anxiety is not a thing. They've got those crazy labels right now. I had a bit of a rant on the mental health summit when I was doing my presentation about the fact that we've got each month, we've got a new mental health issue label, like generalized anxiety disorder, and ODD and DDD, whatever D's, standing for disorder. That's, to me, I'm sorry, that's utterly ridiculous, because a lot of those people, if I have them in practice, within a few sessions of therapy, they're good to go. They don't have that problem anymore, okay? So we don't want to label people and burden them with this label. And now they think, oh shit, now I have this problem. Now I have to live with this problem. Now it's becoming part of my life. Oh, well, if that's part of my life, then it's becoming part of my identity. That's actually quite damaging, because the moment that you have those, and poor self-worth, by the way, is emotionally toxic, right? But the moment you have people attaching to those labels, you have a much harder job of fixing it, because now we go into the core of the onion. Everybody's stuff, emotional stuff, mental stuff is like this onion. We often hear that analogy, right? And you've got loads and loads and loads and loads of layers. Your self-worth, your identity is the very core of that onion. So if you start affecting it by attaching to some labels that somebody's just they came up with it like last month, and now suddenly, oh, it's a big thing and you need medication for it. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, is it me? I mean, I think that's pretty crazy.
No, I agree with you completely. Yeah. As someone who has studied the DSM and, you know, has gone through and had to memorize the details of hundreds of such diagnoses, I completely agree with you. So what can be done about this? Let's shift into the practical solutions aspect of this. How, from your paradigm of how you think about what's causing emotional toxicity, how it acts in the body. Actually, you know what? I want to step back. And before we get to the practical solutions, I have one thing I want you to comment on, because you've commented a few times about people being in a stressed aspect of their nervous system. You've also alluded to the ventral vagal system. And so you're kind of talking about polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges's polyvagal hypothesis of how the nervous system operates. And I've seen that kind of come under attack in recent years. There's been several people that have attempted to debunk it, or, you know, I read an article just last week from a psychologist, I believe, who was saying, you know, the polyvagal theory is dead, and that she was basically saying, you know, this pains me because I practiced for many years kind of from this model of thinking, and it just is not accurate based on this, this, and this. Anyway, I assume that you've encountered some of those kinds of articles or positions, but do you have any thoughts on the polyvagal theory and how that fits into your into what you're doing, and any thoughts on the criticisms of it?
Yeah, no, I could say a lot of things are dead, but if I say that, what am I actually bringing to the table? On what basis am I saying that? Because from my work and from what I'm seeing with people, if I apply it, at least a rough model, and I'm not really, honestly, quite honestly, even though I like physiology, don't get me wrong, I do like physiology, and I can geek out on physiology. But from the point of view of working with an individual, if I get that individual to help them heal their traumas, and now they're just generally like taking a breather, and now the whole system is more relaxed, they're going to start healing. I mean, like I've seen this for the last 23 years, okay, way before I knew about polyvagal theory, by the way, because when I first started practicing, I didn't know about polyvagal theory, right? So it's very easy to attack and start nitpicking. Oh, you know, is the sympathetic nervous system active in that at that point? And is that minute part of it is still active? And yet things I have, like, I mean, right? So personally, I have heard that, but I know what I'm seeing. I know the results that people are getting. It's that simple, without going to the nth degree on the physiological aspect of what is active when it's active. The point is, if you are relaxed, if you're connected to yourself, if you're centered, you're connected to the breath, you're connected to the body, everything comes down, you're going to start healing. I mean, wow. Yogis knew that. They've known that for a very long time. I'm actually finishing my yoga teacher training. They're not, you know, they're talking about that too. You know, it's something that people talked about way before Stephen Porges came on the scene.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not something that I am going to take a lot of notice of myself. And I'm gonna just doing what I'm doing because it works.
Yeah,
it works.
This was actually your response is remarkably similar to what my response was when it was asked of me in the members group for the Energy Blueprint program. Someone posted this article, and I read it, and I basically said, you know what? Things like meditation, breathing practices, yoga, qigong, you know, on and on and on, massage. Lots of different types of modalities we could talk about, and there's, you know, dozens of others. But these things work, period. We know they work. Now, we have
thousands and thousands of studies, probably just on yoga alone. Obviously, we know that, right?
So the debate over whether someone's proposed model of the physiological mechanisms of how they work is separate from the question of, do the actual practical modalities work or not? And it's important to separate those out, because the mechanisms may be discovered to be, hey, someone's model of the mechanisms, oh, that was wrong, but that doesn't invalidate the modalities. It just means, well, we already know they work, so let's find out what the better model is of the mechanisms of how they work, you know?
And I think they're picking on the really fine detail of it. Overall, we know, everybody knows, because everybody's had the experience. When you are faced with a threat and you feel like you want to fight it or run away, you are in a stress response, right? Everybody knows that because everybody's experienced this. So on this kind of more, general level of the states that you switch between, and then what actually brings you calm and what stresses you out, and then you need to feel how your body responds to that, blah, 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 right? And if you work with that, you can't go wrong. And I think where they're taking it apart is literally on the minute fine details. As I said something in the interview once regarding polyvagal theory, and somebody wrote me an email that, but in this paper, it says that your sympathetic nervous system is still active because it does something to your blood vessel, blah, 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 even when you relax. Okay, and your point is, I mean, so what? But ultimately, actually, it's still true that if you in fight or flight, like a full-blown, like not even full-blown fight or flight, because if you have an emotional conflict and finding something in your head, that's fight or flight too. That without any shadow of a doubt, that's stress to your body and mind. So even something like that will shut down your detoxification pathway. You will shut down your gut. It's like none of that is priority, because the priority is we're in a threat situation and we need to deal with a threat.
Right.
So that's not changed. No matter how they want to take it apart and nitpick, that's not changed. And overall, as you said, all the modalities that we've been using to calm the system down, the entire system, talking about mind and body, if we use that to calm it down, we're going to have a better result when it comes to healing, hands down, without any shadow of a doubt. And all the vagus nerve stimulation exercises that we always say, these are the same things as yoga, meditation, being in nature, earthing, whatever, cold showers, whatever it is, whether it's hormetic or direct, right? It works. We know it works. So to me personally, I'm not interested, because that's just not good enough. You need to do better than that if you're going to topple it and then put people off. It's a model. At the end of the day, it's a model, right?
Exactly.
But it's a very helpful model for if somebody. I intuitively know it works, and I have developed my right brain enough to be able to work with people intuitively a lot of the time. If I have a client in front of me, I never say, oh, that's what I'm going to do with the client. No, I work with what's in front of me, because I am intuitive enough to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. But I also like to satisfy my left brain and say, well, actually, how, at least more or less, how does that work, right? So for people just to get an idea of, okay, if you're in fight or flight, this happens. If you're in freeze, this happens. That's what it kind of feels like. If you're relaxed, this happens, right? It's still really helpful for people to just get their head around what they're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. And as for the fine detail, I mean, ultimately, who cares, right?
It's a question for researchers in that field to uncover the specifics of how that works. But on a practical level, working with clients, you just need to know, does this work or not? And then you have useful models, imperfect as they may be, to explain to people conceptually what's happening.
Right. Because by the same token, right? I talk a lot about transactional analysis. You're talking about the child, parent, and adult ego states. So like I said, there's the psyche divides into those different parts. You have those different aspects. And then if you get them nicely aligned and getting on with each other, you're going to have this perfect peace and calm. If they're fighting each other all the time, you're going to have emotional conflict. Now, somebody could come and say, well, that's not, you can't prove that that's the case. You can't prove that there's a parent, an ego, and child in your head.
Yeah.
Well, of course I can't, but it's just a very useful concept.
Yes.
And people respond really, really great to that. And if you work particularly doing some subconscious program clearing or realigning or belief work, this is so useful. And yes, it's just a model. No, we can't prove that that actually exists in people's heads. But you know, that's the thing. It's the research side of it, and it's working with real individuals who want real results. And quite honestly, my clients really couldn't care less if somebody says, oh, it doesn't quite work that way, because you know, they get results. That's all they care about.